I first noticed her on an ordinary evening, the kind of evening where nothing remarkable usually happens. The hallway was quiet, the faint hum of the air conditioning filling the space between my footsteps and the soft creak of the floorboards. And then she appeared, standing by her door, her presence commanding yet unassuming. There was an ease about her that made her seem untouchable, yet the warmth in her smile suggested she was quietly welcoming me into her orbit. She was dressed simply, yet every detail, the way her blouse draped over her shoulders, the soft sway of her hair, spoke of effortless elegance. I caught the subtle glint of a bracelet on her wrist as she adjusted her hair, and the motion was enough to hold my attention longer than I intended. When she looked up, her eyes met mine, and for a moment time seemed to pause. There was something unspoken there, an invitation I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. Our first words were casual, polite greetings that barely scratched the surface of the tension threading between us. But the air seemed charged. I noticed how she lingered near the doorway, her posture relaxed but her gaze precise, like she was taking me in, measuring my reactions. When she brushed past me, our hands accidentally touched, and the warmth of her skin sent a shiver through me. It was subtle, fleeting, yet it lingered in my mind, making me acutely aware of her nearness. I found myself noticing the little things, the soft rhythm of her breathing, the faint perfume that seemed to trail behind her, the way her eyes sparkled with a hint of mischief. There was a quiet confidence about her, a sense that she had lived through enough to carry herself with grace. Yet beneath it, I sensed a vulnerability she didn't share easily. And in that vulnerability, I felt a strange pull, a desire to understand the layers she kept carefully hidden. As I fumbled with my words, trying to sound casual, I realized that this encounter wasn't ordinary at all. There was an intensity beneath the surface, a tension that made my chest tighten in ways I hadn't expected. My mind raced with questions. About her, about myself, about why someone older, more experienced, could affect me so profoundly in such a brief moment. The hallway felt smaller now, charged with possibility. Even the distant sounds of the city outside seemed muted, as if the world itself had narrowed to the space between us. And when I finally left, the image of her lingered in my mind. The curve of her smile, the tilt of her head, the quiet steadiness in her eyes. I knew, somehow, that this was the start of something that would unravel slowly, deliberately. A tension that would grow with each meeting, each glance, each accidental touch. It was a simple encounter, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of promise. A beginning that neither of us fully understood, but both of us would feel in every subtle glance and every heartbeat that followed. It started with a casual message that somehow felt heavier than it should. She asked if I could come by to help her with something small. A bookshelf, a minor repair. On any other day, it would have been a simple errand, nothing more. But when I arrived, the air in her apartment was different. Warm, inviting, almost intimate. The faint scent of jasmine mingled with the faint hum of a record player in the corner, a melody that seemed to underscore the tension I didn't yet fully understand. She greeted me with that same calm confidence that made everything about her magnetic. "Come in," she said, her voice low and smooth, carrying a subtle lilt that made me pause longer than necessary at the threshold. Her hand brushed mine briefly as she guided me past the door, a light touch that felt accidental yet deliberate enough to set my pulse racing. There was a grace in her movement, the way she leaned slightly as she adjusted a cushion or set down a cup of tea, as if every small motion was an invitation I hadn't yet learned to read. We moved into the living room, settling across from each other on the sofa. She poured tea for both of us, and the cup she handed me lingered in her hands just a moment too long. I noticed the warmth of her touch, the faint tremor in her fingers that betrayed a vulnerability beneath her confident exterior. Our knees nearly touched, and though neither of us acknowledged it, I could feel the electricity in the space between us. Conversation started casually, a mix of everyday topics and small jokes. Yet beneath the words, there was an undercurrent, a rhythm of pauses, lingering glances, and subtle smiles that communicated more than speech could capture. Her eyes held mine a second longer than polite, and I found myself leaning in, drawn to the warmth and quiet strength she exuded. Even the way she sipped her tea, slowly, deliberately, seemed designed to keep me attuned to her presence. At one point, she shifted slightly on the sofa, her arm brushing mine. The contact was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet it left a subtle heat behind. I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't anticipated, a mixture of nervous excitement, curiosity, and the undeniable pull of attraction. She caught my gaze and smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips that made my chest tighten. The evening stretched on, measured in soft laughter, quiet conversation, and those moments of proximity that made time feel elastic. I couldn't ignore the way her presence lingered even when we weren't speaking directly. There was an intimacy in the silence, a shared space charged with unspoken possibilities. By the time I left, the ordinary errand had transformed into something entirely different. A first step into a connection neither of us fully understood, yet both felt in every brush of the hand, every tilt of her head, and every lingering glance. It was a night that promised the slow, careful unfolding of something deep, quiet, and undeniably magnetic. The evening had settled into a quiet intimacy, the kind that makes ordinary surroundings feel charged with meaning. We had lingered in her living room after the earlier laughter and casual conversation, the record player humming softly in the background. Outside, the city lights blinked in distant patterns, but inside, the world seemed to shrink around us, leaving only the faint warmth radiating from her presence and the rhythm of our breathing. We sat on the sofa, a deliberate distance apart, though each movement seemed calculated to bridge it. She had a cup of tea in her hands, her fingers wrapped around it in a way that made her look both composed and subtly vulnerable. When she spoke about her day, I noticed the softness in her voice, the tiny hesitations that hinted at experiences she hadn't shared with anyone else. And I realized, almost painfully, how deeply I wanted to be the one to hear them. The conversation shifted naturally, from mundane topics to memories of the past. Small confessions that revealed the layers she carried beneath her confident exterior. She mentioned a heartbreak long ago, a moment that had shaped her trust in others. The words were careful, almost casual, but her eyes betrayed the weight behind them. I felt the urge to reach out, to bridge the gap between us with reassurance, yet hesitated, unsure if my presence would comfort or intrude. And then it happened, the quiet moment that needed no words. Our eyes met across the sofa, and something unspoken passed between us. A question, a truth, a vulnerability that neither of us dared to voice yet both of us acknowledged. I felt the subtle warmth of her body as she leaned slightly toward me, her shoulder brushing against mine. The contact was slight, but it sent a shiver through me, an acknowledgement of the silent pull threading between us. Time seemed to stretch in that space. Every glance, every subtle gesture became amplified. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way her fingers traced the rim of her teacup, even the gentle rise and fall of her chest. All of it communicated a language of intimacy that words could not capture. My own chest tightened, my heartbeat quickened, and I became acutely aware of how deeply I was drawn to her. Not just physically, but emotionally. In that silence, I realized the truth I hadn't been ready to admit. I was falling for her, quietly, irreversibly. And the most astonishing part was that she seemed to feel it too. Our shared stillness, our mutual awareness, spoke louder than any confession could. There was no rush, no need for declarations. Only the simple, profound acknowledgement that we were both present in this moment, vulnerable yet safe, curious yet restrained. By the time I left her apartment that night, the image of her stayed with me. The softness of her gaze, the subtle warmth lingering from our brief touches, the quiet confession that needed no words. It was the first real step in a connection that promised to unravel slowly, deliberately, a tapestry of emotions woven in silence, glances, and the unspoken understanding that something extraordinary had begun. The evening carried a different energy, one charged with anticipation and subtle mischief. I found myself back in her apartment, ostensibly to continue our conversation from before, but the air between us seemed heavier this time, charged, alive, almost dangerous in the most tantalizing way. The soft hum of the city outside had faded into a distant murmur, leaving only the warm glow of her living room lights and the way shadows danced across her walls. She leaned casually against the doorway, her posture relaxed yet commanding, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. There was something in the way she watched me that made my chest tighten, a mixture of challenge and invitation. Every subtle movement, from the tilt of her head to the gentle arch of her brow, was deliberate yet effortless. It was clear she knew the effect she had, and she was enjoying it. Our conversation began lightly, teasing remarks and shared laughter, but the undertone was unmistakable. Every pause seemed measured, every glance loaded with unspoken meaning. She stepped slightly closer, just enough for the warmth of her presence to brush against me. The soft scent of her perfume, familiar now yet intoxicating, seemed to wrap around me, and I felt my pulse quicken. And then, she bit her lip, a small, almost imperceptible motion that sent a jolt straight through me. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "One step closer," she whispered, her voice low, teasing, yet serious enough to send a thrill running down my spine. "And I'll make sure you never forget this night." The world seemed to narrow to the space between us. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, the subtle shift in her stance that brought us closer without breaking the boundary she had set. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once, the kind of tension that made every nerve in my body alert, every heartbeat loud in my chest. I wanted to move, to close the distance, but her words held me in check, making the anticipation almost unbearable. She let the moment linger, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the doorway, an unspoken question hanging in the air. I could feel the tension in my own body, the desire to reach out, the fear of overstepping, the exquisite pleasure of being caught in this delicate dance of proximity and restraint. Her playful danger was intoxicating, a magnetic pull that was impossible to resist yet impossible to act on carelessly. Every subtle movement she made, the sway of her hips as she shifted her weight, the soft rustle of her clothes, the glint of mischief in her eyes, felt deliberate, designed to heighten the moment. And yet, beneath the teasing, there was vulnerability too, a quiet invitation to understand her deeper self, if only I dared to approach carefully. By the end of the evening, I left her apartment feeling both exhilarated and utterly captivated. That night marked a turning point. The tension between us had grown undeniable, charged with playful danger and unspoken desire. I knew that this slow-burn attraction was no longer a casual curiosity. It was becoming something deeper, something that would unfold deliberately, thrillingly, with each careful step we took toward one another. After the intensity of our previous encounter, a quiet tension settled over the next few days. I found myself thinking about her constantly. The curve of her smile, the warmth in her eyes, the teasing glint that had sent my heart racing. Yet, with every thought came hesitation, a knot of uncertainty about whether I was reading the signals correctly, whether my feelings were appropriate given the subtle, undeniable age difference. When I returned to her apartment that evening, the air between us felt fragile, charged, and full of unspoken questions. She greeted me with that familiar calm, yet there was a softness in her expression that hinted she, too, felt the weight of what had passed between us. As I stepped inside, I became aware of every detail. The muted lighting casting gentle shadows across her walls, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the warmth of her hand brushing briefly against mine as she guided me toward the sofa. Each small gesture, though casual on the surface, carried layers of meaning that my heart struggled to decode. We settled into our usual positions, close enough to feel each other's presence but far enough to maintain an unspoken distance. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft hum of the city outside and the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath our feet. It was a quiet, shared tension, the kind that made ordinary surroundings feel electric. Every glance, every shift in posture, felt amplified, as if the room itself held its breath. She spoke first carefully, her words casual but tinged with vulnerability. A pause here, a fleeting glance there, and I could sense her internal conflict mirroring my own. I realized that beneath her confident exterior, she was wrestling with hesitation too, wondering how far she could allow herself to feel, how much of her heart she could risk revealing. I felt a surge of empathy and desire, but also the need to tread lightly, to honor the delicate boundary between boldness and overstepping. When our hands brushed lightly as we reached for the same book, a jolt of warmth shot through me. The contact was brief, yet it lingered in memory, in heartbeat and in breath. I wanted to close the distance, to feel her presence fully, but the hesitation held me back. A mixture of respect, fear, and the intoxicating tension of wanting something I couldn't yet claim. She noticed it too, I could tell, in the subtle lift of her brow, the quiet sway of her body, the faint curve of her lips that hinted at both amusement and longing. The evening passed slowly, measured in pauses, fleeting touches, and the electric silence that filled the space between our words. Every glance, every careful gesture deepened the emotional intimacy, yet the hesitation prevented us from collapsing fully into desire. It was a delicate dance, a slow exploration of boundaries and feelings, where restraint only heightened the connection. When I finally left, the memory of her lingered, her soft laughter, the subtle heat of her hand against mine, the way she looked at me with a mixture of curiosity, vulnerability, and quiet longing. The hesitation was no longer a barrier. It had become part of the allure, a slow-burn promise that what was unfolding between us would grow deliberately, meaningfully, and with every heartbeat, deeper than either of us had dared to imagine. The evening had arrived with a quiet inevitability, the kind that made every moment feel deliberate, every movement significant. When I stepped into her apartment, I was acutely aware of the air between us, the charged mix of longing and restraint that had been building over weeks. The lights were dim, casting soft shadows across the walls, accentuating the gentle curves of her silhouette as she moved. There was no rush tonight, no urgency. Yet, every gesture, every glance, felt pregnant with meaning. We sat together on the sofa, closer than usual, the space between us narrower than ever before. The warmth of her presence brushed against me with every subtle movement, and I became painfully conscious of the way my own body responded. How my pulse quickened at the faint brush of her hair, how the soft brush of her hand against mine sent a jolt of awareness straight through me. Words seemed unnecessary. Our connection spoke through the small, deliberate actions that filled the room with intimacy. She reached for a book on the side table, and her fingers grazed mine as she handed it over. The contact was fleeting, yet it lingered in memory, a silent confession that carried the weight of what we hadn't yet dared to voice. I wanted to say something, anything, to acknowledge the pull between us, but instead, I let the moment speak for itself, allowing my own hands to remain steady yet responsive, leaning into the quiet tension that had become our language. Then came the shift, the subtle, almost imperceptible movement where our knees touched, then pressed gently together. A shiver ran up my spine, a mixture of excitement and tenderness that left me breathless. Her head tilted slightly, bringing her forehead to rest against mine for a moment that felt suspended outside of time. I could feel the warmth of her cheek, the soft rhythm of her breath, the faint flutter of her pulse beneath my fingers. Every small touch, every heartbeat, became a conversation in itself, a confession without a single word spoken. She leaned back just enough to meet my gaze, her eyes shimmering with vulnerability and quiet longing. There was no teasing this time, no playful tension. Only the raw, tender acknowledgement of what had been building between us. Slowly, deliberately, she rested her hand on mine, the weight of the gesture carrying both reassurance and desire. I felt the steady warmth of her palm, the gentle pressure that spoke volumes about trust, attraction, and the emotional intimacy we had carefully cultivated. In that space, all hesitation melted away. There was no need for grand declarations. The subtle choreography of our movements, the leaning in, the light touches, the silent exchanges of glances, was more powerful than words could ever be. I realized, fully and utterly, that we were both giving each other permission to feel, to want, to connect, to be vulnerable together. When the evening drew to a close, we remained close, sitting side by side, fingers intertwined, foreheads pressed lightly together. The confession had not come in words, but in every touch, every shared breath, every lingering glance. It was a perfect, tender culmination of the slow burn journey, an emotional peak that promised something lasting, profound, and undeniably real. The days that followed our quiet confessions felt lighter, yet charged with a tender anticipation. There was no rush, no frantic declaration of feelings, just a deep, unspoken understanding that had settled between us. Every interaction, every shared glance, carried the weight of what we had begun together, and I found myself savoring each moment with a new awareness, a quiet joy that was both exhilarating and grounding. That evening, I returned to her apartment with the sense that something had shifted definitively. The familiar warmth of her home embraced me immediately, the gentle glow of the lights, the faint fragrance of her perfume still lingering, and the soft hum of music that seemed to wrap the room in comfort. She greeted me with that signature smile, the one that had first captivated me in the hallway weeks ago, but now it held a softness, a quiet relief, as if she, too, was embracing the path we had chosen. We settled together by the window, watching the city lights blink in slow, deliberate rhythms. There was a calm intimacy in the silence, punctuated only by the occasional laughter that slipped out naturally, unforced. Our hands found each other's, fingers intertwining without hesitation, the warmth of her touch grounding me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. Every brush of her palm against mine was a reassurance, a subtle promise that this connection, slow, deliberate, and carefully nurtured, was real and enduring. We spoke in gentle tones, sharing thoughts and reflections that had remained unspoken before. There was no urgency in the conversation. It flowed naturally, punctuated by quiet moments where words were unnecessary. Her head rested lightly against my shoulder, and I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, a comfort and a thrill all at once. Every inhale, every exhale, every subtle movement between us carried meaning. It was a language of touch, presence, and vulnerability that neither of us needed to define aloud. The evening deepened, and I noticed the small gestures that had become part of our rhythm. Her hand brushing a strand of hair from my forehead, the way she leaned slightly closer when I spoke, the soft press of her cheek against mine as we shared a quiet laugh. There was no flamboyant gesture or dramatic declaration, just the steady, growing certainty that we had found something rare, a connection that honored both desire and respect, passion and patience. By the time I left, the city outside felt softer, quieter, more alive. I lingered for a final moment, our fingers entwined, foreheads resting together, hearts communicating a truth words could not capture. This was the culmination of a journey built on slow, deliberate steps, on hesitation and playful danger, on silent confessions and tender touches. It was an ending that felt complete, warm, and entirely real. As I stepped out into the night, I carried the memory of her presence with me. The gentle weight of her hand in mine, the quiet steadiness of her gaze, the unspoken understanding that we had discovered something lasting. The slow burn romance that had begun in a simple hallway glance, a fleeting touch, and a teasing smile had reached its resolution. A quiet, enduring warmth that promised more, but in the right time, with the right care, and with hearts fully open to one another. If you enjoyed this slow burn, age gap romance, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that explore the subtle magic of forbidden attraction and quiet love. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever experienced a connection that left your heart racing without a single word spoken?